Welcome to part 2 of Jane Eyre, reimagined as we continue the classic book and reimagine it in the style of best-selling author Margaret Atwood. If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 9 Shadows and Whispers. April blossomed into May, a cruel seductress in her serene sky blues and soft touches of sunlight that whispered of freedom, a freedom starkly at odds with the iron-bound walls of Lowood. It was an insurgence of green, a rebellion of blooms against the sombre tones of confinement. Lowood itself seemed to shake off its pallor, donning a vivid cloak of floral insurgence, as if flora were nature's own guerrilla fighters, seeding life in the face of decay. I was nearly alone in my enjoyment of this insurgence, a solitary figure meandering the boundaries of permissible space. My feet, once victims to the tyranny of frost, now trod upon a carpet of wild primroses, their pale gold faces glinting like scattered coins in a sunlit treasury. These flowers were not merely botanical entities. They were symbols of resistance against the lingering chill of past oppressions. And yet, despite the visual feast of liberty, a miasma of pestilence brewed in the underbelly of our asylum. The forest dell, cradling Lowood, breathed out fog as if exhaling the ghosts of winter, infecting the spring with its silent, deadly effluvia. Typhus, like a spectral thief, crept through the crowded dormitories, transforming the school into a makeshift sanatorium. The paradox of spring's vibrancy, juxtaposed with the stench of sickness, painted a grotesque fresco of life and death intermingled. Miss Temple, a sentinel of care, had turned her full attention to the ill, her presence a constant in the sick rooms, leaving us, the healthy few, with an almost anarchic freedom. The usual strictures loosened, and we roamed the woods like sprites, untethered from the mundane horrors of our confined existence. Even in this pseudo-liberty, the spectre of death danced among the shadows, a reminder that the verdant embrace of the forest could not shield us from the inevitable. In the midst of this, Helen Burns, the quiet nucleus of my earlier school life, had become a whispered name, her presence fading into the spectral realms of the sick and sequestered. My heart, a battlefield of conflicting emotions, yearned for her company, yet I found solace in the companionship of Mary Ann Wilson, whose sharp wit carved a semblance of normalcy in the abnormal. One late evening, as twilight danced with the first stars, Mary Ann and I ventured deeper into the woods than usual. The moon, a silent observer, cast her pale light over our path, guiding us back through unfamiliar terrain. It was upon returning that we learned of Helen's dire condition, her existence hanging by a thread thinner than the gossamer threads of spiderwebs in the moonlight. Driven by a tumultuous surge of need, I defied the nocturnal stillness of Lowood to seek Helen's room. The hush of the corridors was a stark contrast to the riotous chorus of my own thoughts, each step a drumbeat of urgency. I reached her side, finding not the spectre of death I had dreaded, but the gentle calm of her enduring spirit. "Helen," I whispered, a tremor in my voice, "are you awake?" Her response, a soft affirmation, was a balm to my frayed nerves. There, in the dim glow of a solitary candle, our conversation meandered through the ethereal topics of faith and the hereafter, her voice a soothing melody against the harsh discord of my fears. "Do not grieve when I am gone, Jane," she urged, her words a tapestry of tranquillity and acceptance, for to die young is to escape prolonged suffering. As I nestled close, her presence was a fortress against the spectral shadows of death lurking just beyond our bubble of candlelight. Her assurances of a celestial beyond were both a lighthouse and an anchor, promises of a reunion in some distant, starlit hereafter. When dawn breached the horizon, washing the world in hues of hope and renewal, I awoke enveloped not in the arms of a friend, but in the cold, clinical embrace of reality. Helen was gone, and with her, a piece of my own soul seemed to drift into the nebulous realms she had spoken of so confidently. Her grave, marked now not just by nature, but by a stone etched with resurgam, "I shall rise again," stood as a testament not only to her life, but to the cycle of rebirth I felt unfolding within me. In the shadow of death, life whispered promises of resurgence, of revolutions both internal and external, as if each bloom on her grave was a silent echo of her enduring spirit. Chapter 10. A New Bondage. My life has been a tapestry of inconsequence, a dull record of my trivial days, each chapter of my early years detailed with a meticulousness that belies their insignificance. Yet this is not to be a mundane memoir. I invoke memory only when she promises intrigue. Thus I shall leap over 8 silent years, stitching the past with a scant few threads. After typhus fever's grim dance had exhausted itself at Lowood, leaving a trail of corpses, its horror summoned public scrutiny. The school's squalor, its rancid water, meagre food, and threadbare clothing, became a scandal. Outrage swelled, like a storm gathering strength, and the consequence was a rejuvenation. New benefactors, with deep pockets and shallow egos, funded a better edifice. The curriculum was enriched, and sustenance improved. Mr. Brocklehurst, his pride bruised but his status intact, was now merely a figurehead amidst more enlightened overseers. Lowood transformed, shedding its grim past to become a beacon of education. I stayed, moulded by this renaissance, 6 years a pupil to a teacher, and both roles I filled with fervour and competence. Those years were steady, not unhappy, their monotony softened by my hunger for knowledge and the delight of pleasing my teachers. Miss Temple, the guiding light through Lowood's darkest times, had been my rock, my solace. Her marriage and subsequent departure cast a shadow over me, unmooring my spirit. In her absence, the tranquil order she instilled in me faded, replaced by a stirring disquiet. I felt as though a vital limb had been severed, not that I was incapable of peace, but the very reason for it had vanished. I watched her leave, a spectre in a travelling dress, the post-chaise carrying her away to a distant horizon. That half-holiday granted in honour of her departure, I spent in solitary reflection. My room, a cell of contemplation, echoed with the absence of her presence. I paced, believing I mourned a simple loss, yet the setting sun revealed a deeper metamorphosis. The persona Miss Temple cultivated within me began to unravel. Her serene influence dissipated, leaving me exposed to the raw elements of my own nature. I craved freedom, the real world beyond Lowood's gates, where a diverse landscape of hopes and fears, thrills and dangers beckoned. At my window, the twilight's embrace felt both liberating and confining. Lowood's walls and the distant hills formed a prison of familiarity. The road winding between mountains was a siren call. I remembered my arrival, an eternity ago, each vacation spent within these bounds, untouched by the world beyond. I hungered for liberty, praying to the indifferent winds. When even this desire seemed futile, I despaired, begging for any change, even a new form of servitude. The supper bell interrupted my reverie. The routine resumed, yet that night, with Miss Gryce's snores as my reluctant lullaby, my thoughts raced. Liberty was an elusive spectre, but servitude. There was something tangible in that. I had served at Lowood. Could I not serve elsewhere? The idea germinated, sprouting into a plan as the candle burned low. I wrote an advertisement for the newspaper, seeking a position in a private family. The mundane details were ironed out in my mind, and I fell asleep, a seed of hope planted in the fertile soil of my dreams. Dawn found me restless. The letter, a tangible symbol of my new resolve, was posted that evening, amidst rain and darkening skies. The week dragged on, each day a century, until I once more walked to Lowton, this time with a heart pounding with anticipation. The post office yielded a single reply, its brevity filled with promise. A situation offered by a Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield, for one pupil, a little girl. The writing was shaky, but the prospect respectable. The ensuing days were a blur of preparations. I secured references, packed my modest belongings, and awaited the carrier. A chapter of my life was closing. Another, mysterious and fraught with possibility, was about to begin. My excitement was a fever that burned through my weariness. As I wandered the halls, a message came, someone to see me. Bessie, a familiar figure from my past, now married with children, stood before me. Her visit was a thread connecting me to Gateshead, a reminder of old ties and unfinished stories. Our conversation was a blend of reminiscence and revelation, her straightforward words a balm and a spur. The past was a cocoon, but it was time to break free, to find what lay beyond. The next morning, as I boarded the coach to Millcote, I felt a curious mix of trepidation and exhilaration. The road ahead was uncharted, but it was mine to travel. The echoes of Lowood faded with each mile, the landscape of my future unspooling before me, vast and unknown. This was my new servitude, a self-chosen bondage, with the distant promise of liberty. Chapter 11. The Uncharted Inn. A new chapter unfurls like a scene in an intimate play. Imagine, if you will, the room at the George Inn in Millcote, walls adorned with gaudy wallpaper, a carpet that's seen better days, and furniture with the stubborn durability of the practical over the elegant. The mantelpiece displays an assortment of knickknacks, including portraits of George III and the Prince of Wales, alongside a dramatic depiction of Wolfe's death. The light from an oil lamp hanging from the ceiling casts a warm glow, competing with the crackling fire near which I sit, still cloaked and bonneted, thawing out the chill of a 16-hour journey on this raw October day. The town clock strikes 8 as I count the minutes since leaving Lowton at the ungodly hour of 4 a.m. Though seemingly comfortable, my mind churns with anxiety. I expected someone to meet me here, to hear my name called as I descended the coach's steps. Yet no familiar voice, no waiting carriage. I inquired of the waiter if anyone had asked for Miss Eyre. The answer was a disheartening no. And so here I am, alone in this inn-room, my thoughts troubled by doubts and fears. Being adrift in the world, cut off from all ties, is a strange sensation for the young and inexperienced. Adventure offers its sweet thrill, pride warms the soul, but fear gnaws persistently. As the minutes tick by and solitude deepens, fear takes root. I ring the bell. "Is there a place called Thornfield nearby?" I ask the returning waiter. "Thornfield? Not sure, ma'am. I'll check at the bar." He disappears, but returns almost immediately. "Are you Miss Eyre?" "Yes," I reply, my pulse quickening. "There's someone waiting for you." I grab my muff and umbrella and hurry to the passage. A man stands by the door, beside a dimly lit one-horse carriage. "This your luggage?" he asks brusquely, pointing to my trunk. "Yes," I confirm. He hoists it onto the carriage, and I climb in, asking how far it is to Thornfield. "About 6 miles," he replies. "How long will it take?" "Maybe an hour and a half." He shuts the door and takes his place outside. The journey is slow, offering ample time for reflection. Leaning back, I ponder the plainness of the servant and the carriage. Mrs. Fairfax must be practical, I muse, not one for grandeur. Perhaps she lives quietly, alone except for this little girl. If she is kind, I think, I will manage well enough. My best efforts succeeded at Lowood. Surely they will suffice here. Yet, should Mrs. Fairfax turn out to be another Mrs. Reed, I am not bound to stay. I can always advertise again. Peering out the window, I see the lights of Millcote fade behind us. The landscape changes, less picturesque than Lowood, more populated, busier. The misty night and heavy roads slow our progress further. stretching the hour and a half to what feels like an eternity. Finally, the driver announces we are near. We pass a church, its bell tolling, and soon after, through a pair of gates into Thornfield. The house looms ahead, candlelight flickering in one window. The car stops and a maid opens the door. "Will you walk this way, ma'am?" she says, leading me through a grand hall into a cosy room. An elderly lady, knitting by the fire, greets me with a warmth that melts my apprehensions. "Mrs. Fairfax, I presume?" "Yes, my dear. Come, warm yourself by the fire. You must be cold after your long journey." Her kindness is a balm to my weariness. She fusses over me, removing my shawl and bonnet, ordering hot negus and sandwiches. I'm treated more like a guest than an employee, a stark contrast to my expectations. As I settle in, the conversation turns to Thornfield and my future pupil. Mrs. Fairfax speaks of her own solitary winters, the welcome presence of little Adela Varens, and the occasional visits of Mr. Rochester, the master of Thornfield. Her words paint a picture of a lonely but warm existence, punctuated by the rare company of visitors and the liveliness of a child. Later, Mrs. Fairfax shows me to my room, a small, cosy chamber next to hers. The climb up the narrow oak staircase and through the cold, vault-like gallery is almost eerie, but the warmth of my room dispels any lingering fears. I kneel by the bedside, offering up thanks for this unexpected kindness, and soon fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning brings a new perspective. Sunlight filters through blue chintz curtains, revealing a room bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to Lowood's austerity. Hope stirs within me, a sense of a new beginning. I dress with care, conscious of my plainness, but determined to present myself well. Exploring Thornfield, I find it a grand yet welcoming place. Mrs. Fairfax shows me its many rooms, each more imposing than the last, until we reach the attic. There, amidst the old furniture and relics of the past, I feel the weight of history and solitude. A strange laugh startles me, but Mrs. Fairfax dismisses it as the work of Grace Poole, a servant known for her oddities. As I descend to the more lively regions of the house, I am introduced to Adela, my pupil. She is a lively child, eager to show off her accomplishments. Our morning passes in a blur of lessons and conversation, her fluent French a pleasant challenge. By the time we join Mrs. Fairfax for dinner, I feel a curious blend of trepidation and excitement. Thornfield is a place of contrasts, its grandeur tempered by warmth, its solitude broken by unexpected laughter. It promises both challenge and comfort, a new chapter in my life's unfolding drama. The scene is set in a theatrical manner, the room's details as vivid as stage props. The large figured wallpaper, the worn carpet, the practical furniture, and the portraits on the mantelpiece all come to life under the glow of the oil lamp and the warmth of the fire. These elements reflect the protagonist's internal state, a mixture of discomfort, anticipation, and a yearning for warmth and security. As I sit there, attempting to shake off the chill of my journey, my mind is anything but tranquil. The lack of a welcoming party at the inn casts a shadow of doubt over my decision to come here. The fear of being alone, adrift without a clear path, begins to creep in. The inn-room becomes a microcosm of my uncertainty, a liminal space between the known hardships of Lowood and the unknown challenges of Thornfield. When the waiter informs me that someone is waiting, a spark of hope ignites. I grab my belongings and follow him eagerly. The man by the door, standing next to a modest carriage, is brusque and efficient. As I climb into the carriage and we set off, I have time to reflect on the simplicity of my new surroundings compared to the oppressive grandeur I had feared. The plainness of the servant and carriage suggests a more manageable, perhaps even kind future. The slow journey through the misty night and heavy roads becomes a metaphor for my mental state, uncertain, cautious, and filled with a mix of fear and hope. The passing lights of Millcote fade into the distance, and the unfamiliar landscape symbolizes the uncharted territory of my new life. Finally, we reach Thornfield. The imposing house, with its single-lit window, stands as a beacon in the darkness. Inside, Mrs. Fairfax's warmth and kindness are a stark contrast to my expectations. Her fussing over me, her genuine concern, and the cosy fire all help to melt away my apprehensions. The domestic details, such as her housewifely bunch of keys, create a sense of comfort and stability. As we converse, Mrs. Fairfax's descriptions of Thornfield and its inhabitants paint a picture of a life that, while lonely, is filled with small, meaningful connections. Her mention of Mr. Rochester and Adela Varens introduces a sense of mystery and anticipation. Her kindness reassures me, but I remain cautious, aware that first impressions can be deceiving. The next morning, the sunlight streaming into my room lifts my spirits. The room's bright, cheerful appearance contrasts sharply with the austerity of Lowood, symbolizing a new beginning. My careful preparation reflects my determination to make a good impression and seize this opportunity for a better life. Exploring Thornfield, I find it both grand and welcoming. Mrs. Fairfax's tour of the house, including the eerie attic filled with relics of the past, deepens the sense of history and solitude. The strange laugh that startles me adds a touch of the uncanny, hinting at hidden stories and unseen presences. Meeting Adela, my pupil, brings a sense of purpose and challenge. Her eagerness to show off her accomplishments, her fluent French, and her lively personality promise a dynamic relationship. Our morning lessons are a blend of discovery and adaptation, each of us learning from the other. By the time we join Mrs. Fairfax for dinner, I feel a blend of trepidation and excitement. Thornfield, with its contrasts and mysteries, promises both challenge and comfort. It is a place where domestic tensions can rise to dramatic and political levels, where personal growth and broader themes of escape and freedom can unfold. This new chapter in my life's drama is one of hope and uncertainty, of new bonds and uncharted paths. Chapter 12, The Unseen Horizon. The promise of a smooth career, hinted at by my calm introduction to Thornfield Hall, held true upon deeper acquaintance with the place and its inhabitants. Mrs. Fairfax proved to be precisely what she appeared, a placid-tempered, kind-hearted woman with competent education and average intelligence. My pupil, Adele, was a lively child, occasionally wayward due to past spoiling, but soon she adjusted to my care. With no interference from others, she became obedient and teachable, her vivacious prattle and efforts to please fostering a mutual affection between us. Yet this cool language might seem stark to those who idealize children, expecting educators to idolize their charges. I'm not writing to flatter parental egotism or uphold falsehoods. I felt a genuine concern for Adele's welfare and progress, and a quiet liking for her, just as I appreciated Mrs. Fairfax's kindness and enjoyed her company in proportion to her moderate regard for me. Blame me if you will, but there were times when, walking alone in the grounds or climbing to the leads of the attic, I longed for more. Peering out over the fields and hills, my gaze extended to the dim skyline, yearning for a vision that could surpass the confines of Thornfield. I desired to see the bustling world beyond, the towns and lives I had only heard of. I believed in the existence of more vibrant forms of goodness and wanted to witness them firsthand. Who blames me for this restlessness? Perhaps many. They might call me discontented, but the longing was in my nature. It agitated me to the point of pain, and my only relief was to walk the silent third-story corridor, letting my mind dwell on bright visions and my heart swell with life. I opened my inward ear to an endless tale spun by my imagination, filled with the incident, fire, and feeling absent from my actual existence. It is futile to claim humans should be content with tranquility. We crave action and will create it if it cannot be found. Millions are condemned to stiller lives than mine, silently rebelling against their lot. Women, supposedly calm by nature, feel just as men do. They need to exercise their faculties and find fields for their efforts. To confine them to making puddings, knitting stockings, playing piano, or embroidering bags is narrow-minded and thoughtless. Often, while alone, I heard Grace Poole's strange laugh and eccentric murmurs. Sometimes she was silent, other times the sounds were inexplicable. Her appearance, however, was a dampener to curiosity. Hard-featured and staid, she lacked interest. My attempts to converse with her were met with monosyllabic replies, cutting short any effort. The rest of the household, John and his wife, Leah the housemaid, and Sophie the French nurse, were decent but unremarkable. Sophie and I spoke French, but her vague, confused answers about her native country discouraged further inquiry. October, November, and December passed. One January afternoon, Mrs. Fairfax requested a holiday for Adele due to a cold. Adele's eager support of the request reminded me of my own childhood delights, so I agreed. It was a calm, cold day, and tired of sitting in the library, I offered to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax in Hay. 2 miles away, the walk promised a pleasant break. After settling Adele by Mrs. Fairfax's fireside with her best wax doll and a storybook, I set out. The ground was hard, the air still, and the road lonely. Walking briskly to warm myself, I then slowed to savour the moment. The church bell tolled as I passed, its charm lying in the approaching dimness and the low gliding sun. A mile from Thornfield, I sat on a stile, gathering my mantle and muff about me. From my perch, I looked down on Thornfield Hall, its grey battlements silhouetted against the west. The sun set behind the trees, and I turned eastward. The moon rose, pale yet brightening, over Hay, its few chimneys sending up thin smoke. Though a mile away, the village murmurs reached me in the stillness. My ear caught the flow of distant streams, threading unseen dales and depths. This evening calm betrayed the tinkle of nearby brooks and the sough of remote becks. A rude noise disrupted this serenity, a tramp, a metallic clatter. A horse approached, its rider hidden by the lane's windings. I remained seated to let it pass. The memories of nursery tales filled my mind, including Bessie's stories of the North of England spirit, the Gytrash. As the horse neared, a great dog, black and white, glided by the hazel stems. It was exactly as described, a lion-like creature with a huge head, but the rider, a man, dispelled the spell. No Gytrash, just a traveller. The horse slipped on ice, and man and beast tumbled. The dog barked furiously, and I approached. The traveller struggled free, swearing under his breath. "Are you injured, sir?" I asked. He muttered a formula before replying, "You must just stand aside." I did, but watched as he struggled to his feet, his efforts vigorous enough to suggest he was not seriously hurt. The horse was eventually re-established, and the dog silenced. The traveller felt his foot wincing. I offered to fetch help. "Thank you, I shall do. I have no broken bones, only a sprain," he said, attempting to stand, but wincing again. Daylight lingered, and the moon waxed bright. I could see him clearly, middle height, broad chest, dark face with stern features and a heavy brow. He looked past youth, but not yet middle-aged. Had he been handsome, I might have felt shy, but his rough demeanour set me at ease. "If you're hurt and want help, sir, I can fetch someone from Thornfield Hall or Hay," I offered again. "Thank you, but you can help me a little yourself if you will," he said, trying to move again, but failing. I assisted him, fetching his horse's bridle. The horse was spirited, evading me, but with persistence, I brought it to him. He leaned on my shoulder to mount, biting his lip against the pain. "Now, make haste with the letter to Hay, and return as fast as you can," he instructed. His spurred heel sent the horse bounding away, the dog following. They vanished into the dusk, and I continued my walk, pondering the encounter. It was a trivial event, yet it marked a change in my monotonous life. The new face, masculine and stern, lingered in my mind. Upon returning to Thornfield, I hesitated. Entering the house felt like returning to stagnation. The thought of spending the evening with tranquil Mrs. Fairfax quelled the faint excitement of my walk. The security and ease of Thornfield were becoming stifling. I longed for the storms of a struggling life, to appreciate the calm amidst which I now repined. I lingered outside, drawn to the sky, the moon ascending in solemn march, the stars trembling. The clock struck in the hall, recalling me to earth. I turned from the celestial scene, entered the side door, and was greeted by the warm glow of the dining room, where voices mingled cheerfully. In Mrs. Fairfax's room, I found only Pilot, the great dog. Leah informed me that Mr. Rochester had arrived with Adele and Mrs. Fairfax, and had sent for a surgeon due to an accident. His horse had slipped on ice in Hay Lane, spraining his ankle. I went upstairs to remove my things, contemplating the shift in my evening. Mr. Rochester's arrival introduced a new dynamic, a change in the monotony. The evening promised a blend of the familiar and the new, the domestic and the dramatic, hinting at broader themes of escape and freedom yet to unfold. Chapter 13. The Riddle of Thornfield. Mr. Rochester, under the surgeon's orders, retired early that night and rose late the following morning. His day was consumed by business. Agents and tenants awaited his attention. Adele and I vacated the library, now a bustling reception room. I relocated our books to an upstairs room, turning it into a new schoolroom. Thornfield Hall felt transformed, no longer the silent, church-like place I had known. Instead, it echoed with knocks, the clang of the bell, footsteps, and new voices. The trickle of the outside world had breached its walls, and I found I liked it better this way. Adele was restless, darting to the door and peering over the banisters, eager for a glimpse of Mr. Rochester. She concocted excuses to venture downstairs, hoping to visit the library, where she knew she wasn't wanted. When I grew stern and made her sit still, she chattered incessantly about her ami, Monsieur Edward Fairfax de Rochester. She speculated on the gifts he might have brought, having hinted the night before that his luggage contained a little box of interest to her. Et cela doit signifier, je said, qu'il y aura là-dedans un cadeau pour moi, et peut-être pour vous aussi, mademoiselle. Monsieur a parlé de vous. Il m'a demandé le nom de ma gouvernante, et si elle n'était pas une petite personne, assez mince et un peu pâle. J'ai dit que oui, car c'est vrai, n'est-ce pas, mademoiselle? Adele and I dined as usual in Mrs. Fairfax's parlour. The afternoon was wild and snowy, so we stayed in the schoolroom. As darkness fell, I allowed Adele to put away her books and work, guessing Mr. Rochester was now at liberty. Left alone, I walked to the window, but the swirling twilight and snowflakes obscured the view. I let down the curtain and returned to the fireside. In the glowing embers, I traced a view reminiscent of a picture I had seen of Heidelberg Castle on the Rhine. Mrs. Fairfax's entrance shattered the fiery mosaic I was piecing together, dispelling my heavy, unwelcome thoughts. Mr. Rochester would be glad if you and Adele would take tea with him in the drawing-room this evening, she said. He has been so busy all day that he couldn't ask to see you before. When is his tea time? I inquired. At 6 o'clock. He keeps early hours in the country. You'd better change your frock now. I'll help you. Here's a candle. Is it necessary to change my frock? Yes, you had better. I always dress for the evening when Mr. Rochester is here. This added formality seemed a bit grand, but I went to my room and, with Mrs. Fairfax's aid, replaced my black stuff dress with my only other dress, a black silk one. I added a small pearl brooch, a parting gift from Miss Temple, and we went downstairs. Unaccustomed to strangers, it was a trial to appear formally before Mr. Rochester. I let Mrs. Fairfax precede me into the dining-room and kept in her shadow as we crossed to the drawing-room. 2 wax candles illuminated the table and the mantelpiece. Pilot basked in the fire's warmth. Adele knelt beside him, and Mr. Rochester reclined on a couch, his foot propped on a cushion. The firelight highlighted his broad, jet-black eyebrows, square forehead, and grim features. His athletic, broad-chested frame harmonized with his stern face. Mr. Rochester must have been aware of our entrance, but he didn't acknowledge us. Mrs. Fairfax spoke up. "Here is Miss Eyre, sir." He bowed, still gazing at the dog and child. "Let Miss Eyre be seated," he said, his tone conveying impatience and indifference. I sat down, relieved by the lack of forced politeness. His eccentricity was piquant. I was curious to see how he would proceed. Mrs. Fairfax, feeling the need for amiability, began to talk. She condoled with him on his busy day and his painful sprain, commending his patience. "Madam, I should like some tea," was his sole rejoinder. She rang the bell, and when the tray arrived, she arranged the cups with efficient celerity. Adele and I went to the table. Mr. Rochester remained on the couch. "Will you hand Mr. Rochester's cup?" Mrs. Fairfax asked. "Adele might spill it." I complied. As he took the cup, Adele seized the moment to ask, "N'est-ce pas, monsieur, qu'il y a un cadeau pour Mademoiselle Eyre dans votre petit coffre?" "Who talks of cadeaux?" he asked gruffly. "Did you expect a present, Miss Eyre? Are you fond of presents?" His dark, piercing eyes scrutinized me. "I hardly know, sir. I have little experience with them." "Generally thought. But what do you think?" "I'd need time to answer that properly, sir. A present has many faces, doesn't it? One should consider all before giving an opinion. Miss Eyre, you are not as unsophisticated as Adele. She demands a cadeau clamorously. You beat about the bush." "Because I have less confidence in my deserts than Adele. She has the claim of old acquaintance and the right of custom. I have neither." "Don't fall back on over-modesty. I examined Adele and saw you've taken great pains with her. She's not bright, but she's improved. You've now received your cadeau, Miss Eyre. Praise of your pupil's progress." "Thank you, sir," I said. "That is the reward teachers most covet." He grunted, sipping his tea in silence. After the tray was taken away, Mr. Rochester invited us to the fire. Adele wanted to sit on my knee, but was told to amuse herself with Pilot. "You've been at Thornfield 3 months?" "Yes, sir." "And you came from?" "Lowood School, in Shire." "Ah, a charitable concern. How long were you there?" 8 years. 8 years? No wonder you look otherworldly. When I saw you in Hay Lane, I thought of fairy tales. Who are your parents?" "I have none." "Nor ever had, I suppose. Do you remember them?" "No." "So you were waiting for your people when you sat on that stile?" "For whom, sir?" "For the men in green? Did I break through one of your rings, spreading that damned ice on the causeway?" "The men in green forsook England 100 years ago. Not even in Hay Lane will you find a trace of them. Their revels are gone for good." Mrs. Fairfax had dropped her knitting, eyebrows raised. "Well, if you disown parents, you must have kinsfolk, uncles and aunts." "None I ever saw." "And your home?" "I have none." "Where do your siblings live?" "I have none." "Who recommended you here?" "I advertised, and Mrs. Fairfax answered." "Yes," said Mrs. Fairfax, now understanding. "I'm thankful for the choice Providence led me to make. Miss Eyre is invaluable." "Don't trouble yourself with eulogies, Mrs. Fairfax. I judge for myself. She began by felling my horse." "Sir?" said Mrs. Fairfax, bewildered. "Miss Eyre, have you lived in a town?" "No, sir." "Seen much society?" "None but Lowood's pupils and teachers, and Thornfield's inmates." "Read much?" "Only what came my way, not numerous or learned." "You've lived like a nun. Brocklehurst, Lowood's director, is a parson?" "Yes, sir." "And you girls worshipped him?" "Oh, no. You are cool, no novice worshipping her priest." "I disliked Mr. Brocklehurst. He is harsh, pompous, meddling. He starved us and bored us with long lectures." Mrs. Fairfax remarked, "That was false economy." "And that was the extent of his offences?" "He starved us and bored us with lectures. We feared to go to bed." "What age were you at Lowood?" 10. "And stayed 8 years? You are now 18? "Yes." "Arithmetic is useful. What did you learn at Lowood? Can you play?" "A little." "Of course. Go into the library, leave the door open, play a tune. I obeyed. Enough, he called. You play a little, like any English schoolgirl, but not well. Mr. Rochester continued. Adele showed me some sketches. Were they all yours? Yes. When did you find time? In the last 2 vacations. Out of your head? Yes. That head on your shoulders? Yes. Has it more such furniture? I hope so. He spread the pictures before him, scrutinizing each. I explained them. The first, a cormorant on a submerged mast. The second, a woman's shape rising into a twilight sky. The third, a colossal head against an iceberg. Were you happy painting these? I was absorbed and happy. That's not much. Your pleasures are few. You existed in an artist's dreamland. Did you sit long each day? From morning till night. Self-satisfied? Far from it. Tormented by the contrast between idea and handiwork. Not quite. You've captured the shadow of your thought. The drawings are peculiar. These eyes in the evening star, seen in a dream. Where did you see Latmos? Put the drawings away. I tied the portfolio. Mr. Rochester checked his watch. It's 9 o'clock. Why is Adele up? Take her to bed. Adele kissed him. He endured it barely. Good night. He dismissed us with a wave. Mrs. Fairfax folded her knitting. I took my portfolio. We curtsied and withdrew. You said Mr. Rochester wasn't peculiar, Mrs. Fairfax, I observed. Well, is he? Very changeful and abrupt. True, but I'm accustomed to it. Allowance should be made. Why? His nature and painful thoughts. What about? Family troubles. But he has no family. Not now. He lost his elder brother a few years ago. 9 years is a long time. Was he fond of his brother? Perhaps not. There were misunderstandings. Mr. Roland Rochester was unjust to Mr. Edward. The old gentleman favoured money, anxious to keep the estate. Mr. Edward was put in a painful position. He broke with his family, led an unsettled life. He shuns Thornfield. Why? Perhaps he thinks it gloomy. Mrs. Fairfax was evasive. She couldn't or wouldn't give more information. I dropped the subject. Thornfield's mysteries deepened, wrapped in shadows and secrets, each revelation a step into the unknown. Chapter 14. The Labyrinthine Master. For the next several days, Mr. Rochester was a spectral presence, flitting in and out of Thornfield like a restless ghost. In the mornings, his time was consumed by business, and in the afternoons, gentlemen from Millcote or the neighbourhood called and dined with him. Once his sprain permitted horse exercise. He rode out frequently, often returning late at night. His visits to Adele became rare, and our interactions were confined to brief encounters in the hall, on the stairs, or in the gallery. Sometimes he passed me with a distant nod, other times with a courteous smile, his mercurial moods influenced by unseen forces rather than my presence. One evening, after entertaining guests who left for a public meeting in Millcote, Mr. Rochester, staying in due to the inclement weather, rang the bell. The message summoned Adele and me downstairs. I tidied Adele's hair and ensured my own appearance was suitably plain and neat before descending. The long-awaited petit coffre stood on the dining-room table, instantly recognizable to Adele, who rushed towards it with an exclamation of delight. "Ma boite! Ma boite!" she cried, her excitement palpable. "Yes, there is your boite at last!" Mr. Rochester's voice emerged from the depths of an enormous easy-chair by the fire, sardonic and deep. "Take it into a corner and amuse yourself, but do so in silence." Adele, absorbed in untying the box's cord, needed no further instruction. She exclaimed, "Oh, ciel! Que c'est beau!" and was lost to her own world. "Is Miss Eyre there?" Mr. Rochester called, half rising to look toward the door where I stood. "Come forward. Sit here." He pointed to a chair near his own. "I have no fondness for the prattle of children, nor for simple-minded old ladies. Sit where I placed you, if you please. Confound these civilities. I continually forget them." He rang and summoned Mrs. Fairfax, who arrived with her knitting basket. Good evening, madam. I need you to listen to Adele's prattle about her presence. It will be a benevolent act. Adele promptly filled Mrs. Fairfax's lap with the contents of her box, chattering in broken English. Mr. Rochester turned to me, motioning me closer. Now, Miss Eyre, come forward. I want to see you without disturbing my comfortable position. The dining room was bathed in the warm, festive light of the chandelier and the fire's glow. Mr. Rochester looked less stern than usual, perhaps softened by wine. His eyes sparkled as he lounged in his damask-covered chair, his features illuminated by the fire. "You examine me, Miss Eyre," he said suddenly. "Do you think me handsome?" Caught off guard, I answered truthfully before I could stop myself. "No, sir." "There is something singular about you," he mused. "You have the air of a little nun, quaint and quiet, and when asked a question, you reply bluntly. Why?" "Sir, I was too plain. I beg your pardon. I should have said beauty is of little consequence." "You ought to have said no such thing. Beauty is not of little consequence. Criticize me. Do I not have all my limbs and features like any other man?" "Mr. Rochester, allow me to retract my first answer. It was a blunder." "No, you shall be answerable for it. What fault do you find with me? My forehead, perhaps?" He lifted his hair, revealing a broad brow. "Now, am I a fool?" "Far from it, sir. May I ask if you are a philanthropist?" "There again, no, I'm not. But I bear a conscience." He pointed to his forehead. "And I once had a kind heart. Fortune has battered me, made me hard and tough, but with one sentient point left. Is there hope for me?" "Hope of what, sir?" "Of transforming from rubber back to flesh?" Decidedly he has had too much wine, I thought, unsure how to respond. "You look puzzled, Miss Eyre. That expression suits you." He rose and leaned against the mantelpiece, his broad chest and strong limbs plainly visible. There was an unconscious pride and ease in his demeanour, a reliance on qualities other than physical attractiveness. "I sent for you because the fire and chandelier are poor company. Adele and Mrs. Fairfax do not suffice. I want to learn more about you. Speak." "What about, sir?" "Whatever you like." I remained silent. "You are stubborn and annoyed," he observed. "I don't wish to treat you like an inferior. I ask you to talk to me and distract my thoughts." He had almost apologized, and I felt inclined to comply. "I am willing to amuse you, sir, but I don't know what will interest you. Ask me questions." "Do you agree that I have a right to be masterful and abrupt?" "Do as you please, sir." "That is evasive. Reply clearly." "I don't think you have a right to command me just because you are older or have seen more of the world. Your claim to superiority depends on how you've used your time and experience." Promptly spoken, but I haven't made good use of either. Will you agree to receive my orders without being hurt by the tone? I smiled. Very few masters would care if their subordinates were hurt by their orders. "Paid subordinates? Oh yes, I forgot the salary. On that ground, will you agree to let me hector a little?" "No, sir, not on that ground. But because you care about your dependents' comfort, I agree heartily." "And will you dispense with conventional forms and phrases without thinking me insolent?" "I would never mistake informality for insolence." "Humbug! Most people will submit to anything for a salary, but I mentally shake hands with you for your answer." "You may have defects to counterbalance your good points," I thought, meeting his eye. "Yes, I have plenty of faults," he admitted. "I have a past that might make me harsh on myself. At 21, I was set on the wrong path and never recovered. I envy you your peace of mind and unpolluted memory." "How was your memory at 18? "Clear and pure. I was your equal then, but now I am a common sinner, despite my original nature. Do you wonder that I tell you this? People will instinctively confide in you because you listen without scorn. How do you know?" "I can't be sure," I replied. "I only know you said remorse is the poison of life." "And repentance is its cure, sir." "No, reformation is. And I could reform if not for my burdens. But I will get pleasure out of life, cost what it may." "Then you will degenerate further, sir." "Possibly, but fresh pleasure may be sweet." It will sting. You never tried it, you are ignorant, but you can laugh. Believe me, you are not naturally austere. I must put Adele to bed. Wait a minute. I have watched Adele. She is a curious study. She is now dressing in a new frock and will soon return, looking like a miniature of Céline Varens. Soon Adele reappeared, transformed. Her dress of rose-coloured satin and silk stockings made her look like a tiny ballerina. Est-ce que ma robe va bien? She asked, twirling before Mr. Rochester. Précise lie, he replied. She charmed my gold out of my pocket. My spring is gone, but I rear this French floweret as a penance. Good night. I took Adele to bed, my mind swirling with thoughts of Mr. Rochester's labyrinthine character and the peculiar dynamics at Thornfield. Chapter 15. Shadows and Flames. Mr. Rochester eventually explained it one crisp afternoon as we meandered through the grounds. Adele, lost in her play with Pilot and a shuttlecock, left us to our conversation as we strolled down a beach-lined avenue. She's the daughter of a French opera dancer, Céline Varens, he began, his tone a mix of bitterness and amusement. I was once besotted with her, believing myself her idol. She claimed to return my feelings with superior ardour, preferring my taille d'athlète to the elegance of Apollo. I was flattered and foolish. The air around us was still and cold, reflecting the icy clarity with which he recounted his past. Thornfield's old trees stood silent, their bare branches stark against the steel-grey sky, mirroring the starkness of his revelations. I set her up in an hotel, he continued, with a retinue of servants, a carriage, diamonds, the works. I was, as they say, ruining myself in the traditional manner. One night I called unexpectedly. She was out, but I decided to wait in her boudoir, suffocated by the scent of musk and amber. Stepping onto the balcony, I lit a cigar and watched the gas-lit streets below. Mr. Rochester paused to light a cigar, exhaling a trail of smoke that mingled with the frigid air. I saw her return in the carriage I'd given her, accompanied by a cavalier. A hiss of jealousy rose within me, a green snake writhing in my chest. I listened as they entered her boudoir, their conversation trivial and mercenary. My love for Céline extinguished itself in that moment. The avenue stretched before us, a path of shadows and light, much like his narrative. His words painted vivid images, stark contrasts of betrayal and disillusionment. After discovering her treachery, I confronted her, ending our liaison. I challenged her companion to a duel and left him with a bullet in his arm, but Céline had already given me Adele, claiming she was my daughter. Though I doubted it, I couldn't leave the child in destitution. I brought her to Thornfield, hoping she might grow up clean in this English soil. Adele ran ahead with her shuttlecock, her laughter a bright contrast to the dark story unfolding. I felt a deepened sense of responsibility for her, a resolve to protect and nurture her in this harsh world. No, Adele is not responsible for her mother's faults, I said. I will care for her, as she deserves better than to be abandoned. We returned to Thornfield, where the flickering candlelight and creaking floorboards hinted at the house's secrets. That night, in the solitude of my chamber, I reflected on Mr. Rochester's revelations. His past, marked by passion and betrayal, cast a long shadow over his present. Yet there was something undeniably magnetic about him, a complexity that drew me in despite the darkness. As I lay in bed, I heard a peculiar, lugubrious murmur. Rising, I listened, heart pounding. The sound ceased, but my tranquillity was shattered. Moments later, I heard a demonic laugh outside my door, followed by retreating footsteps. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to investigate. Smoke filled the air, and I found Mr. Rochester's room ablaze. Acting swiftly, I doused the flames, saving him from a fiery end. He awoke in a bewildered fury, but his anger soon gave way to gratitude as he realized what had happened. "You saved my life," he said, his voice tinged with a strange energy. "You've snatched me from a horrible death. Thank you, Jane." As dawn approached, I returned to my chamber. my mind awash with tumultuous thoughts. Mr. Rochester's vulnerability had stirred something within me, a blend of concern and connection. I lay awake, pondering the enigma of this man who had become both a source of fascination and a beacon of uncertainty in my life. The night's events had cast Thornfield in a new light, a place where shadows lurked and secrets whispered. My role here was more than that of a governess. It was entwined with the fate of a complex and troubled soul. As the first light of morning crept through the windows, I resolved to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that even in the darkest places, a spark of light could always be found. For several days following the fire, Mr. Rochester's presence was a phantom, flitting at the edges of my perception. I felt the weight of his gaze even in his absence, a tangible force pressing upon my senses. The mansion, so recently animated by the bustle of guests and the clatter of business, seemed now to breathe in sync with the rhythm of my solitary thoughts. Adele, blessed with a child's resilience, quickly rebounded from the fright, her laughter ringing out once more in the old corridors. But my own mind was less easily calmed. The night of the fire replayed endlessly in my head, every detail etched with the precision of a nightmare that refuses to fade. "Jane," Mr. Rochester said one afternoon, finding me alone in the library. His voice broke through my reverie, a low murmur that sent shivers down my spine. "Walk with me." We stepped into the wintry garden, the air crisp and biting. Thornfield stood behind us, its grey stones and dark windows a silent witness to the secrets it harboured. Mr. Rochester moved with a restless energy, his stride purposeful, his expression closed. "You must wonder about that night," he began abruptly. "About the fire, about Grace Poole." I nodded, my breath visible in the cold air, mingling with his in fleeting, intertwining clouds. "Grace Poole is a mystery even to me," he said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "She's mad, you see, not dangerously so, not usually. She's harmless most of the time, but there are moments when her madness takes on a darker form." The garden, with its skeletal trees and frost-covered ground, seemed to echo his words, each step crunching in the silence like a footfall on brittle glass. "Why do you keep her here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to break the spell of his confession. "Out of necessity," he replied, "and out of a twisted sense of duty. She has been with the family for years, and I cannot simply cast her out. She has no one else." His words hung in the frigid air, heavy with unspoken implications. Duty and necessity, concepts that bound us all, in ways both seen and unseen. We walked in silence for a time, the wind biting at our faces, carrying with it the scent of snow and decay. Thornfield loomed behind us, its shadow long and unyielding. "You must be careful, Jane," he said finally. "This house is not what it seems. Its walls are thick with secrets, its halls echo with whispers. You must tread lightly and keep your wits about you." "I will," I promised, feeling the weight of his gaze upon me, a mix of concern and something else, something darker, more possessive. As we returned to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a labyrinth, its twists and turns leading to an uncertain end. The light was fading, the garden bathed in the pale, ghostly glow of twilight. Thornfield's windows stared back at me like dark, unblinking eyes, holding within them the promise of revelations yet to come. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in my mind, a tangled web of questions and half-formed fears. Mr. Rochester's warnings echoed in my thoughts, mingling with the memory of his voice, his touch, the look in his eyes. The house was silent, but it was a silence filled with presence, with the weight of history and the burden of hidden truths. I knew that my time at Thornfield was only beginning, and that the path ahead would be fraught with dangers and discoveries, with moments of light and darkness interwoven. In the stillness of the night, I made a vow to myself, to face whatever lay ahead with courage and resolve, to unravel the mysteries that surrounded me, and to protect those I cared for, no matter the cost. The journey would not be easy, but I felt a newfound strength within me, a determination that burned as fiercely as the fire I had extinguished. As dawn approached, I rose and went to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, the first light of morning casting long shadows across the ground. Thornfield stood before me, a fortress of stone and secrets, and I knew that my place within its walls was more vital than ever. The path was set, the journey begun, and I was ready to face whatever awaited me in the labyrinth of Thornfield Hall. Chapter 16. Shadows of the Unseen. The day after my sleepless night, a mix of anticipation and dread filled me. I longed to hear Mr. Rochester's voice, yet feared meeting his eyes. I expected him to appear at any moment, stepping into the schoolroom as he occasionally did. But the morning passed in its usual monotony, Adele's studies uninterrupted by any sign of him. After breakfast, the quiet was disrupted by a flurry of activity near Mr. Rochester's chamber. I heard Mrs. Fairfax's voice, mingled with Leah's, the cook's, and even John's gruff tones. Snatches of conversation drifted to my ears. What a mercy master wasn't burnt in his bed! Dangerous to keep a candle lit at night. Providential he had the presence of mind to think of the water jug. Hope he doesn't catch cold sleeping on the library sofa, and so forth. When I descended to dinner, I passed his room, now restored to order. Leah stood in the window seat, rubbing the smoke-dimmed panes. As I advanced, I saw another figure, Grace Poole, sitting by the bed, sewing new rings to the curtains. Her brown gown, check apron and white cap presented a picture of staid domesticity at odds with the notion of a woman who had attempted murder. Her face, hard and unremarkable, showed no trace of guilt or fear. "Good morning, miss," she said, her tone phlegmatic, her manner as composed as ever. She resumed her sewing with a steady hand, her thoughts seemingly absorbed in the task. "Good morning, Grace," I replied. "Has anything happened? I thought I heard the servants talking earlier." "Only master reading in bed last night," she said, not looking up. "He fell asleep with his candle lit, and the curtains caught afire. Fortunately, he woke before the bedclothes or woodwork caught, and put out the flames with the water in the ewer." "A strange affair," I murmured. "Did Mr. Rochester wake no one? Did no one hear him?" She met my gaze, a flicker of something in her eyes before she responded. "The servants sleep far off, miss. Mrs. Fairfax's room and yours are the nearest, but she heard nothing. When people get old, they often sleep heavily." She paused, then added with a marked tone, "But you're young, miss, and a light sleeper. Perhaps you heard a noise." "I did," I said softly, so Leah couldn't hear. "I thought it was Pilot, but Pilot can't laugh, and I'm certain I heard a laugh, a strange one." Grace Poole threaded her needle with unhurried precision. "It's hardly likely master would laugh in such danger, miss. You must have been dreaming." "I wasn't dreaming," I said, a sharp edge to my voice, provoked by her cool composure. "Have you told master you heard a laugh?" she inquired. No. "I haven't had the chance to speak with him this morning." "Did you think to open your door and look into the gallery?" I sensed she was probing for information. If she discovered my suspicions, she might plot against me. I decided to be cautious. On the contrary, I bolted my door. "Then you're not in the habit of bolting your door every night?" Her question seemed designed to learn my habits. Indignation flared within me. "I often omit to bolt the door, but in future I shall make sure it's secure." "Wise," she replied. "This neighborhood is quiet, but it's best to be safe. A door is easily fastened, and a drawn bolt between oneself and mischief is prudent. Many trust all to Providence, but I say Providence often blesses means when used discreetly." Her sermon-like tone ended as the cook entered. "Mrs. Poole, the servants' dinner is ready. Will you come down?" "No, just put my pint of porter and pudding on a tray, and I'll carry it up." "You'll have some meat?" "A morsel and a taste of cheese, that's all." "The sago?" "I'll make it myself before tea time." The cook turned to me, saying Mrs. Fairfax was waiting. I left, my mind a whirl of questions about Grace Poole. Why hadn't she been dismissed or charged after Mr. Rochester's near declaration of her guilt? What mysterious hold did she have over him? I puzzled over her inexplicable position and the enigma of her presence. As I pondered, Mrs. Poole's coarse face and square figure seemed incongruent with the notion of her having power over Mr. Rochester. Yet, what if her eccentricity and strength of character had ensnared him? Perhaps a past indiscretion now rendered him unable to shake off her influence. But my mind rejected this, the image of Grace Poole too firmly etched in its unflattering contours. I turned my thoughts to Mr. Rochester. His kindness, his words, his look last night, they all returned to me vividly. I directed Adele's drawing, but my hands trembled. Qu'avez-vous, mademoiselle? She asked. Vos doigts tremblent comme la feuille, et vos joues sont rouges, mais rouges comme des cerises. I'm hot from stooping, I replied, trying to focus. I forced myself to dismiss the notion of Grace Poole's power over Mr. Rochester. I compared myself to her and found we were different. Bessie had said I was a lady, and I believed it now more than ever. I had brighter hopes and keener enjoyments. As evening approached, I still hadn't seen or heard Mr. Rochester. I hoped to see him before night. When dusk fell and Adele went to play with Sophie, I keenly desired his presence. I listened for the bell, for Leah's footsteps, for Mr. Rochester's tread. Darkness filled the room, but I remained expectant. Finally, Leah came to announce tea in Mrs. Fairfax's room. I went down, glad to be nearer Mr. Rochester. You must be hungry, Mrs. Fairfax said. You ate little at dinner. Are you unwell? Oh, quite well, I assured her. I never felt better. You must prove it by having a good appetite. Will you fill the teapot while I finish this row? She rose to draw down the blind, though darkness had already fallen. It's fair tonight, she said, peering out. Mr. Rochester has had a favourable day for his journey. Journey? I didn't know he was out. He set off after breakfast to Mr. Eshton's place. There's a party there. Lord Ingram, Sir George Lynn, Colonel Dent, and others. Do you expect him back tonight? No, nor tomorrow. He'll likely stay a week. When fine, fashionable people gather, they linger, surrounded by elegance and gaiety. Mr. Rochester is talented and lively, a general favourite. The ladies are fond of him, though his appearance isn't particularly handsome. His talents and wealth make up for that. Are there ladies at the Lees? Yes, Mrs. Eshton and her daughters, and the Honourable Blanche and Mary Ingram, very beautiful women. I saw Blanche 6 or 7 years ago at a Christmas ball Mr. Rochester gave. She was the belle of the evening. What was she like? Tall, fine bust, graceful neck, dark olive complexion, large black eyes, raven hair. She wore a white dress with an amber scarf and flower. She was greatly admired. Is she not married? No, neither she nor her sister have large fortunes. I believe Mr. Rochester admires her, but there's a considerable age difference. He's nearly 40, she's 25. What of that? Unequal matches are made every day. True, but I scarcely think Mr. Rochester would entertain such an idea, but you eat nothing. Have another cup? Adele entered, and the conversation shifted. Alone again, I reviewed what I'd learned. Memory and reason battled within me, revealing my folly and hopeless fantasies. You, I scolded myself, a favourite of Mr. Rochester, you, important to him, foolish, self-deceiving Jane. He showed you tokens of preference. How dared you? I vowed to myself, tomorrow, draw your own portrait faithfully, without softening a defect. Then paint Blanche Ingram with all her beauty and elegance. Compare them. Remind yourself of your station. I sketched my portrait and completed an ivory miniature of an imagined Blanche Ingram. The contrast was stark, grounding my emotions. The task occupied my hands and mind, preparing me for the trials ahead. My self-imposed discipline paid off. When subsequent events unfolded, I faced them with a calm I might otherwise have lacked. Chapter 17. The Weight of Absence. A week passed, then another, and still there was no sign of Mr. Rochester. Thornfield Hall, in his absence, seemed to be holding its breath. The house was a dormant beast, vast and shadowy, with only the occasional stirrings of life from the servants or Adele to remind me that it was inhabited. Mrs. Fairfax speculated that he might head straight from the Leas to London, or perhaps even to the Continent, and not show his face again at Thornfield for a year or more. Such abrupt departures were not unusual for him, she said, though her words offered little comfort. A strange chill settled over me, and with it a sense of foreboding that I could not shake. The early mornings were the worst. The grey light of dawn creeping into my room was like the cold fingers of doubt pressing against my temples. I had to force myself to remember my place. "You have nothing to do with the master of Thornfield," I repeated, like a mantra, trying to summon the strength to push away the gnawing unease. "You are here to teach his ward, nothing more. Don't let yourself believe you are anything more to him." Days turned into weeks, and I busied myself with Adele's lessons, the mundane routines of the household, and my own relentless thoughts. I began to consider leaving Thornfield, crafting imaginary advertisements and pondering potential positions elsewhere, though none seemed as satisfying or as frightening as the one I held now. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Fairfax received a letter from Mr. Rochester. "It's from the master," she announced, her voice trembling with anticipation as she broke the seal. "We'll finally know when to expect him." I continued sipping my coffee, feeling an inexplicable warmth spread through my cheeks. My hand trembled slightly, causing a small spill. I chose not to examine the reasons for this reaction too closely. "Well, I sometimes think we are too quiet, but we run a chance of being busy enough now, for a little while at least," Mrs. Fairfax said, her eyes still scanning the letter. I tied the string of Adele's pinafore and helped her with another bun and more milk, all the while pretending indifference. "Mr. Rochester is not likely to return soon, I suppose?" I asked nonchalantly. "Indeed he is, in 3 days," she replied. "And not alone either. He's bringing guests from the Leas. We need to prepare the best rooms and clean the library and drawing rooms. We'll need more kitchen help from the George Inn and perhaps elsewhere. The ladies will bring their maids, and the gentlemen their valets. We'll have a full house." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Thornfield Hall, already immaculate to my eyes, underwent an exhaustive cleaning. Adele, released from her lessons, flitted about in excitement, her joy palpable. I found myself pressed into service, learning to make custards and French pastries, to truss game and garnish dishes, my usual routine abandoned in the frenetic preparations. The party was expected on Thursday afternoon. As the day approached, my anticipation mingled with a gnawing sense of unease. Thornfield transformed into a hive of activity, the house sparkling under the industrious efforts of the staff. Even Adele's unrestrained enthusiasm couldn't dispel my creeping doubts and dark conjectures. On the morning of their arrival, I saw Grace Poole emerge from the third-story staircase, her figure as enigmatic as ever. She moved quietly, a spectral presence in the bustling household, her routine unchanged despite the impending influx of guests. I overheard Leah discussing Grace with the charwoman. Grace's wages were significantly higher than the other servants, and she was saving diligently. It seemed no one questioned her peculiar position. The mystery of her role at Thornfield remained, and I felt deliberately excluded from it. Thursday came, and the house stood ready, resplendent in its finery. Mrs. Fairfax donned her best gown to receive the guests, and Adele, too, was dressed for the occasion, though I doubted she would be introduced to the visitors immediately. For myself, I saw no need to change my attire. The schoolroom had become my sanctuary, a place of refuge. The day, mild and serene, was one of those early spring days that hint at summer. As evening approached, Mrs. Fairfax, resplendent in her black satin gown, remarked on the time. "It's past 6. John has gone to the gates to see if there's any sign of them." A few minutes later, John's return heralded the arrival of the guests. Adele and I watched from the window as the carriages approached. Mr. Rochester led the cavalcade on his black horse, Pilot bounding ahead. Beside him rode a lady in a purple riding habit, her veil streaming behind her. "Miss Ingram!" exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax, hurrying away. Adele pleaded to go down, but I kept her with me, knowing Mr. Rochester would be displeased if she ventured into sight. The hall buzzed with the sounds of arrival, and the air filled with the harmonized tones of greetings. I listened from the schoolroom, aware of the distinct presence of Mr. Rochester's voice amidst the lively exchanges. Adele and I remained hidden, the sound of music drifting up from the drawing-room. The voice of a lady singing, followed by a duet and then a glee, created a rich tapestry of sound. I found myself straining to hear Mr. Rochester's voice, the distance rendering his words indistinct but familiar. The clock struck 11, and Adele's head drooped against my shoulder. I carried her to bed, my thoughts unsettled by the evening's events. The next day the guests set out for an excursion. I watched them depart and return, noting how Mr. Rochester stayed close to Miss Ingram. "You see, Mr. Rochester clearly prefers her," I remarked to Mrs. Fairfax. "Yes, he admires her," she replied, and I felt a pang of something I could not name. That evening Mr. Rochester requested Adele and me to join the guests after dinner. I reluctantly agreed, dreading the encounter. Adele, in her pink satin frock, looked as grave as a judge. I dressed in my best, feeling the weight of my silver-grey gown and the pearl brooch. We entered the drawing-room while it was empty, the room adorned with flowers and candles. Adele asked for a flower to complete her attire, and I gave her a rose, watching her face light up. The ladies entered, their presence magnifying the room's elegance. I felt small and insignificant as they moved with the grace of white-plumed birds. Among them were Mrs. Eshton and her daughters, Lady Lynn, Mrs. Colonel Dent, and the Ingrams, tall, stately, and proud. Miss Ingram, beautiful and accomplished, seemed to embody everything Mr. Rochester might desire. Her laugh was satirical, her demeanour self-conscious. I compared her to the miniature I had painted and found her a perfect match. The gentlemen entered, and Mr. Rochester came in last. He did not look at me, and I felt the chasm between us widen. I could not help but watch him, his presence commanding my attention. His stern features and penetrating gaze held me captive, and I realized how deeply I had come to care for him, despite my efforts to remain detached. Miss Ingram engaged Mr. Rochester in conversation, and I listened, hidden in the shadows. Their exchange was a dance of wit and provocation. She played the piano, and he sang with a voice that stirred my heart. I slipped away, my emotions in turmoil. In the hall, I knelt to tie my sandal, only to find myself face to face with Mr. Rochester. "Why did you not speak to me?" he asked. "I did not wish to disturb you," I replied. He scrutinized me, noting my pallor. "You've grown paler. What's the matter?" "Nothing, sir. Return to the drawing-room. It is my wish." "I am tired, sir." He looked at me intently. "And a little depressed. What about? Tell me." "Nothing, sir." He saw through my facade. "I expect you in the drawing-room every evening while my guests are here. It is my wish. Don't neglect it." "Yes, sir," I whispered, feeling the weight of his words. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "Good night, my—" He stopped, biting his lip, and abruptly walked away. I watched him go, my heart a tempest of longing and confusion. The night stretched on, the shadows deepening, and I knew that the days ahead would bring challenges I was not yet prepared to face.
This is the end of Part 2 of Jane Eyre, reimagined in the style of best-selling author Margaret Atwood. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. Please let us know what you think about this audiobook in the comments section. We will see you soon for Part 3.